handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er 8 9er out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck. 2 rounds AGBT. Gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. You know, I happened to look up on the TV just in the last day or so, and I saw this face on TV early in the morning before I had to go play my tennis match, and I had a feeling I knew this cat, and I got with this Major Scott Huesing, a Marine of 24 years, 10 deployments in 60 countries. And congratulations to Major Scott Huesing, because he has just introduced his new book, Echo in Ramadi. So poor Scott is living out of a suitcase and traveling all over the country, promoting his book, which you can find on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble. And please do. So with that, welcome, Major Scott.
Denise, thanks for having me on the program. It's great to be here.
I want to start off with a kind of a sidebar on before I really get to the book. And it says in my information here that you are the executive director of Save the Brave.
That's correct. And that is a certified nonprofit that was actually started by one of my young Marines who I served with in Ramadi in 2006. His name's Nick Velez. And he and I have remained close, like many of the Marines have that served together with me in Ramadi. And he started out to really connect veterans who are struggling with post-traumatic stress and brought me on as the executive director several years ago. And it's just a great organization. And if you open up the back of Echo and Ramadi on the back flap, you'll see our logo, and portions of the proceeds will go to Save the Brave. It's just something I love to do, to, you know, give to our charity to help veterans. And at the beginning and end of every day, that's really what makes me happy is taking care of our own. And that goes for all veterans, not just Marines.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You know, this PTS thing, Scott, it's just not, I don't know. I mean, it is a colossal problem, but it is just not, it needs to be in the headlines every day, and it's just not there. I just don't think people understand the numbers, and I don't think they understand the quasi treatment that they get at the VA. Did I say that right?
You did. Yeah, that's correct.
What do we do?
Well, for us with Save the Brave and everything I've done, partnering with other great nonprofits and other great supporters, and I'll name a few, like the Semper Fi Fund is a great one. We Are the Mighty. They tell great military stories. My friend Matt Phillips with Jarhead Java donates 50% of the proceeds of his coffee back to the Semper Fi Fund, America's Fund. So we have this great network. So there are solutions to the problem, and our methodology and our thought is that there is no pill or vaccine that is effective to help guys heal than the power of human connection and getting guys together and letting them connect and share their stories. And then when we see guys or girls that are having difficulty, you know, moving through the darkness, we have this great network of resources that we can refer them to. And there's, you know, none of us have a PhD. Well, some of us that support Save the Brave have PhDs, but we don't ever profess to treat, but we help them out, and we help our Gold Star families out. And when, you know, tragedy strikes, and, you know, we're lucky to have the resources to do that, but it takes people supporting our organization. It does take donations, and it does take people's time. And it's an amazing network that I've really been lucky to be a part of. So to see it diminished or marginalized in mainstream media, it is disturbing. It does bother me that it doesn't get the attention that it deserves or that is required. I think when there's so much white noise on mainstream media and in print media as well, that these stories need to be told. And I think they will help guys understand that it's all right to be a little, be hurting, and it's all right to heal. And when I wrote Echo and Ramadi, I talk about some of those things in the book, and I also talk about some of the tragic stories that we had to deal with and the Marines we've lost to suicide related to PTS. And one of those stories that I'll share is about Corporal Simon Litkey, who we lost in 2015 when he took his own life. And when I wrote that part of the book, I probably called his dad, Bob, and his mom, Nikki, in Minnesota at least 20 times to ask them again and again, are you sure you're comfortable with me telling this story? And every time they said, Scott, you have to tell this story. This is how Simon will be, remembered, and it will help people understand that people need to be aware of this. And it was really, heartening to me to have that type of support from those people. And every Gold Star family that I work with, they're always there for me, and they're just amazing people.
Well, thank you for that. Congratulations on the book for sure, but to be able to take kind of a different twist on war, if you will, and include these stories. I mean, your book illustrates the internal thoughts and emotions and actions of Echo Company. And I understand that you interviewed about 75 fellow Marines for the book. Is that right?
Yeah, I did about 75 interviews with the Marines, their families, the soldiers that we fought alongside, our Army brothers that battled alongside of us in Ramadi. And through that process, obviously the book is very, very descriptive about what they went through, and it details that. But like you said, it's not just another war story, Denise. It really is about the people. And yes, it's about the fighting and the friction, but it's also about the emotion and what these, young warriors went through and how they bonded and how they survived on the battlefield as they took care of each other better than anything I've ever witnessed in my life. And it's just something very different. And I wrote it in a way so it was accessible to everybody, not full of military jargon and acronyms, but it's a story that is about individual characters, Denise, but it's also very emblematic of, I think, what every veteran or anyone that served under those type of life-changing, horrific conditions can relate to.
I was kind of struck, Scott, because all of you guys had to adapt to conditions really on the fly, and some of them certainly had some consequences. So, Scott, for a second or two, would you describe how you had to command to that kind of adaptability, including urban warfare, if you will?
Well, fighting in a densely populated city where literally the front line is everywhere, because we lived in the city amongst the people as we conducted patrols and clearance operations going from house to house, room to room, street to street. It's a very complex, compressed, fluid situation when you have to operate under those types of conditions. To compound that, you're fighting an enemy who wears no uniform and blends in with the local people at their will. And when you become engaged in direct, contact with enemy fighters, you're also concerned about protecting those that you're there to safeguard, and that's the local people. And that made up probably, I guess, about 90% of the locals in Iraq. And then there was another 5% that were, hardcore insurgents, and another 5% that were co-belligerents that, wanted to make a name for themselves, I suppose. And when we did fight, which was daily, sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day, in direct contact with the enemy, it was a bad day for them. I mean, the Marines are very well trained, and they know how to perform under those conditions, but they do have to learn and adapt to those ever-changing situations, that fluid environment. But the Marines are masters of it. There's always a motto, adapt and overcome, and the Marines do that. They epitomize it. And it's not just the Marines. Any professional soldier regardless of what job they do in the military, whether they're infantry, kicking in doors and squeezing the triggers on the rifle, or driving trucks or turning wrenches. The Marines and soldiers are dedicated to a degree that most Americans don't know. And that's important. That's why I like to tell about these people and the characters, so that every American understands the real sacrifice that these young kids make. And they are. They're
young.
youngsters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're 18, 19, 20 years old. And the things that I was tasking them to do in such a dangerous environment, making life and death decisions every day, it took me writing the book and, years of age and experience and wisdom along the way to really understand how these young kids must have dealt with that. And I don't think I understood that at the time when I was a 35-year-old captain, because I had all this life experience, but they didn't. And I tasked them to do these superhuman acts on the battlefield. And, I just didn't see the 20-year-old kid. I saw a sergeant. I saw a corporal. I saw a lieutenant. And despite the age or lack of experience in some cases, they always performed phenomenally. And I'm so proud of them then and to this day on how they took care of each other and me.
Yeah, Scott, I'm kind of struck by some of these stories. And so as I was going through the pages, I thought to myself, all right, Scott, he didn't come out the same guy in the back side of the book as he went in on the front side of the book. And I say that because I think that you were learning some things. So revisiting all of these interviews and people and conditions and so forth. Did you and or any of your guys have some kind of a log or a journal or some kind of after action report that you could refer to as a reminder of some of the stories that are told in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I kept a journal. I have a calendar, and that was part of my writing process to make sure that the stories that I told and the accuracy of them was included. And whenever I hit a friction point in my writing, that's when I'd pick up the phone or send an email I'd hit the brakes and call Sergeant Espinosa, and I'd say, hey, man, tell me how this really happened, because this is how I remember it. And he would recite it back to me. And sometimes, believe it or not, my memory was actually pretty good. I always question myself, but I always wanted to make sure it was accurate, because it's, even if only 250 people bought this book, My Marines, and they picked it up and they read it and they said, sir, you got this wrong. They and trust me, Marines will eat their own for breakfast, and my guys would do the same, even to their old CO. And but to this day, Denise, having all of the endorsements from celebrities and four-star generals like Bing West and Ollie North and Dale Dye and General Livingston, they're great. But having the Marines and the families of those Marines we lost call me and tell me that I got it right and that we told the story right and it was important to them, those are the best endorsements, and those are the ones that really make me feel proud that I was able to tell this great story and make sure that it didn't become marginalized amongst the other significant battles that we fought during this long war in Afghanistan or in Iraq or elsewhere. And there's plenty of stories. This is just one. And I write it in the book, and hey man, I'm on the other line on an interview. I'm so sorry.
I love it.
Denise, I'm so sorry. My phone someone called me and it bleeped in.
That's okay. I clearly understand how that happens. That's how we know these things are real.
So sorry.
Well, your book is a story of stories. And I think that is significant. And I also think when you called Espo for accuracy or anybody else, you would hear some emphasis in a part of the story that was important to them, but may not have been as important to you, right?
Well, I obviously don't want to give away that whole chapter about one of my favorite sergeants, who's one of our squad leaders that was shot in Central Ramadi. But all of that he told me, I did not know that any of that happened. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those situations where you think, this only happens in the movies. but it doesn't. It really happened in real life. And I wasn't aware of those facts until I conducted some of these interviews, because that's one of the unique ways that I've written the book, is being able to almost omnipotently see things and tell the story through their eyes. And it's because they shared their stories with me. And that was important to me, because I did, one, want to get it right, and two, give them a voice in the book, because it's important. And you can only tell so many stories in 300 pages. But when I got through that whole process, I submitted the book to my freelance editor, Sylvia Mendoza, and she did a phenomenal job. And as she went through, one of the things she said to me was, Scott, it's great, but there's not enough you in it. And that's when I really had to take a look, as well as a writer and as an artist and as a leader, to say, I've pulled so much emotion and I've pulled so much pain from my Marines and families that I really owed it to the work to share my own experiences.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's when, I decided to, share my story. And it wasn't easy, but some people ask, well, was it some cathartic process that you go through? I don't ever categorize it or label it as that. I think everybody unpacks what they compartmentalize on the battlefield in certain ways. Maybe mine was writing, maybe it was doing, a lot of yard work, or some guys exercise fanatically, or whatever their coping mechanism is to deal with that. I think it's important, and I hope that was demonstrated in Echo and Ramadi, that everybody deals with it. Even your boss deals with it, and it's something that we have to deal with, and we have to talk about. We have to share this, and that's how we stay connected, and that's how we continue to become better leaders. We continue to become better people.
Well, clearly relationships are established where they otherwise would not have been. And some of those relationships have maybe some priorities over others for certain conditions or certain events that may have happened. But, you obviously ended up with some relationship with some Iraqis, especially the interpreters, or if you guys call them the Terps. Explain some of that.
That was so important for me to share their story as well, because our interpreters, or Terps, as we call them, these are young, again, 18, 19-year-old kids that grew up in Iraq in some of the most dangerous places. And then when the insurgency took over and Saddam Hussein's regime fell, they were left to their own. And they suffered and had to find a way to deal with it. And my examples that I use of just two of my interpreters, and there were many, are real success stories, because they not only were these brave citizen warriors of their country in Iraq to join the coalition and work alongside the multinational forces, but they sacrificed so much, and they were thrust into this world of being alongside the Marines. So and my guys oftentimes handle them with the same rough nature that they do with each other, and that was precarious at times because they weren't Marines, but we had to safeguard them and treat them like our own, and we did. So they not only put their own safety at risk, but that of their families, because if there were there were 1,000 cases of threats of intimidation and murder of interpreters and their families. Yeah, because they aligned with the coalition. And to this day, I'm so proud that the two that are mentioned in the book, Big Sam and Ford, are one is an American citizen, and he is now working for the Department of Defense as a senior level interpreter, and he is back in the Middle East right now, serving our country as an American citizen. And the other one has his second master's degree, and this summer will become an American citizen. And I'm so extremely proud of those guys.
That part of the whole story on the battlefield, I don't think gets said enough. Not only from, how many Iraqis, attach their wagons to the Americans, but, the same thing has happened with Somalians. The same thing has happened with some Yemenis. The same thing has happened with, some Syrians and Afghanis. So, the typical writers in the media just go, report on what terrible things the Americans and the military and, the confusion in the battlefield and all that. But yet you do have some remarkable, feel good, honest stories where they know that, we are in there for the right reasons, and they have joined those, that same cause. Scott, your book, I suspect that the Marine Corps and perhaps the other branch services will take your words and the actions described in the book and necessarily study them. Do you have that kind of expectation, or do you know that that is going to become somewhat of a textbook or a study session?
Well, I'd like to think that some of the stories and the lessons are absolutely timeless, and I do hope that they are willing to read it, and we're absolutely going to submit it to the professional reading list for the U.S. military. And that's not just me hoping; it's also based off of legends within the Marine Corps and other seasoned writers who have read the book and say that it should be on the reading list. This should be required reading for all young Marines and junior leaders, because that's the audience. But it's not just military. Any organization that wants to learn about leadership, how to overcome adversity, and how to manage people and understand that it is a people business and that power of human connection is essential to be successful. Those lessons can be applied outside of the military, in the boardroom, in the corporate world. They're just essential for how you become a great leader. And you don't learn it. It's something that you share with other great leaders and take both good and bad experiences and temper those with the best possible decision making you can act on the battlefield. When
you have Marines that have come out of Korea or Vietnam, and I don't know, maybe you have or haven't yet, that have read the book, when they look at their individual battlefield stories as opposed to your Iraq Ramadi story, is there a distinction that they want to bring to your attention? I'm very fortunate, one, that Major General Livingston wrote the foreword to Echo and Ramadi, and he is a Medal of Honor recipient from Vietnam Battle of Dido, 1968. He's also a former Echo Company commander in 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, and he and others, we talk about it a lot. And I'm also now the president of the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines Association, which is pretty top-heavy with Vietnam vets. So when we talk about the comparisons, the Vietnam vets, it's been 50 years. They've been telling their story, and they are so happy that these stories are now being told. And I'm really happy, too, that other great military writers are coming out, and friends of mine that have gotten behind the book, like Jason Delgado, who wrote Bounty Hunter 4-3, and Scott McEwen, who wrote Chris Kyle's story in American Sniper, and Warrior's Faith by Robert Barrett. All of these people that are telling these stories, it's because they don't want them to become marginalized, and I love that. And I don't want them to fade away either, for sure. Yeah, and when we talk about comparisons of Korea or Vietnam and Iraq, Afghanistan, what's important to note is that what we dealt with and what they dealt with was very similar, because it is not just a cliche like war is timeless, but the generations of how they viewed themselves in those environments, I think, has changed. And it makes me proud, because the Marines and the soldiers today that are fighting, I think one distinction is that they have a very different understanding of the culture that they're fighting in. And that's part of our training program within the U.S. military, is this cultural awareness on how to deal with that in an urban environment, in an asymmetric war where they have to be immersed with the locals. And I think it's become a tenet of military training across the board and in programs and systems that we apply to train our young warriors. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Major Scott Huesing, 24-year career as a Marine with 10 deployments in 60 countries, Executive Director of Save the Brave, and his book is Echo and Ramadi. By all means, go grab this book. And Scott, we're humbled by your appearance on the Denise Simon Experience, and best wishes for the success of this book. Well, thanks for having me, Denise. It's my pleasure. I'd love to be back on the program anytime you'll have me. It's my pleasure. I'll call on you, trust me. I tend to do that. All right, thanks. And ladies and gentlemen, more coming your way.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
Then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
let the restoration begin.
Donald Trump came to Washington vowing to drain the swamp and make government work for the American people. But the swamp creatures in D.C. aren't going down without a fight, and the deep state is determined to overturn the election and keep their gravy train rolling. In these turbulent times, it's critical for patriots to stay engaged and be prepared to defend this president. You can stay up to date on Trump's battle to make America great again by listening to America First Radio with Jim Dawes each weeknight at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Liberty Feed.
Hi, it's Mark Walters from Armed American Radio. You know, for nearly a decade, I've been educating, informing, and entertaining responsibly armed Americans. And during that time together, we've shared some ups and downs, haven't we? Trump's election saved our Supreme Court and no doubt the future of our gun rights for now. But now is not the time to lay down. The enemies of freedom are well-funded and more determined than ever. To keep up with the state of your gun rights, make sure to tune in to Armed American Radio right here on Talk America Radio, the new dominant voice in conservative talk radio.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You cannot retreat to your safe spaces. There are no therapy poodles allowed, especially when facing the truth. And that's just how we like it. Straight, hard, conservatarian talk, on the rocks, no chaser. Served up on the Adrian Slade Show. Small, limited government, constitutional conversations, exclusively on Talk America Radio. Every Saturday morning, 9 a.m. on Talk America Radio Liberty.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks for hanging with us here, ladies and gentlemen, on the Denise Simon Experience. CPAC is over, but we're going to get a real report because I have the honor of being joined by Matthew Vadum, who is the author of the book titled Subversion. He is one of the top guns over there at Capital Research Center. He is a contributor to a lot of media sites, including Fox News and Wall Street Journal, and I think it was only last year, or maybe a year before, that he was a featured speaker at the David Horowitz Freedom Restoration Weekend. So lots of credentials, and a previous guest on the Denise Simon Experience. So, Matthew, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Happy to be here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Yay!
It's very Denise Simon. It seems very Denise Simon-y.
It is. We got, during CPAC, we would get these intermittent kind of reports on what was going on, who was speaking, and so forth and so on. But we don't have a full capsule of the entire event. And I looked at the speakers, and there were some, very good speakers. We got to hear all of Trump's speech, but I also wanted to kind of focus in on some other things. And one is they had a gig called the Grassroots Leadership Academy. Are you familiar with that event?
Yeah, a little bit, but I've never gone to one.
You're
talking about the grassroots active, the boot camp.
Yeah. Is that kind of getting after, maybe like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point and kind of going to the millennial age group to, compete with the...
Yeah, it might be. I thought it was the Leadership Institute, but I could be wrong. I think it just teaches people the basics of, activism, how to start what to do. I don't know what the specifics are.
Mm-hmm.
I should go to one of them. I'm kind of curious, but I never seem to get around to going to them. They always happen on the first day of CPAC when, there aren't other, nothing's really going on apart from them, the trainings.
Mm-hmm.
That's on the Wednesday.
Mm-hmm.
And then things really get underway at CPAC on the Thursday, going through to to Sunday afternoon.
What was your biggest impression of the CPAC event, or was there more than one?
Well, it was a lot fewer people than last year, but I guess that's to be expected because Republicans won. So, enthusiasm dies down. It's like donations to conservative nonprofits tend to go down when Republicans win because people think, we got the White House. We don't have to worry. Everything's taken care of. We don't need to worry about it for another 4 years.
That's kind of a dangerous position, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is, which is why nonprofits have to work, conservative nonprofits have to work doubly hard to get donations in these off years.
Now, was the attendance was down, what, 10%, 15% or more?
I'm sorry, I didn't actually see the figures. I just noticed everything I wanted to get into, I got into no problem. Whereas everything was packed to the rafters. A lot of events, like in the main stage and so on, it was very difficult to, unless you showed up really, really early to get seats.
Mm-hmm.
This year, not so much, except for like maybe the president and the vice president speaking, which I never go to because it's too much of a hassle. Easy to just watch it on the TV in the hotel room.
Would you say the crowd is different in previous years, meaning not so much in size, but in age or in maybe interest in certain agenda items?
I have nothing. This is just my personal observation, and it may have little basis in reality, but it seemed to me like there were the percentage of young people was lower this time. That's the impression that I got.
Mm-hmm.
That there were more people, by young people I mean like college age and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There were more people like late 20s and in their 30s and whatever. There are lots of old people like me.
I'm older, so be careful where you tread on age.
Okay. Well, if I'm a certain age and I'm old and you're the same age, you're not old, though, because you're special.
Okay. All right. I like that.
That's just an impression I got. It didn't seem as teeming with as kids as it normally is.
Mm.
And attendance seemed off, but I don't know if they released the attendance figures.
I haven't seen that
I know
either.
the CPAC straw poll was asking questions instead of it was just a regular survey. It was asking questions about what people's opinions on things. It wasn't asking who they'd support for president.
Right.
If an election were held today.
Right. And what do you know what the results were of that straw poll?
That people support Trump. At least the people who answered the questions support Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And they support what he's doing on immigration and in his big policy initiatives that they did on the last day, on the Saturday afternoon. They did release the poll results, and they gave a little slide presentation talking about it. And the pollster, John McLaughlin, came up and explained. So, the Never Trumpers were not very well represented at CPAC this year.
I guess not.
Not that they are normally, but
sure.
They have a lot more. I think their bark is worse than their bite. They're not as strong as there's definitely a lot of them, and a lot of them have power. They're influential, but I don't think they have the sheer numbers that a lot of people think they have.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, you don't have to necessarily like them, but if you're a Republican or a conservative and you're concerned about issues, then you have to appreciate the work that he's doing.
Yeah, that's been the attitude of a lot of conservatives who weren't too keen on Trump. I was skeptical of him in the beginning, as many people were. Mm-hmm. But he's turned out to be quite conservative and effective. And, that's really all I care about.
I do. I agree with you.
Does the right thing. It's, people say things about various lawmakers. Yeah, I don't care as long as he votes right.
Exactly.
So I would have supported, thought Roy Moore. I would have supported him because he's going to vote right most of the time. Mm-hmm. Even though he's not somebody I would normally want to support.
Well, the voting record is most important, and even if somebody doesn't vote the way we need them to, very often it's because law or some kind of measure has got some kind of stupid bundling in it that would cause more harm than good if it passes. So I mean that's just kind of where we end up.
We've got all these politicians and pundits and conservative so-called intellectuals who want to do something about guns, as if guns are the problem. In light of the massacre of 17 people at high school in Parkland, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And when conservatives go soft on that kind of thing, it's troubling. It really you find it. You really test their mettle. You want to see just how conservative they are, because it's easy to be conservative when you're on the popular side of an issue. But when you're conservative on and under attack constantly because you support the Second Amendment, that's saying a lot. A lot of conservatives will buckle under the pressure, like Marco Rubio. Didn't totally cave, but he was like open to new restrictions and measures. And, guns are already, apart from, I guess, the financial services industry, the most heavily regulated industry in America. We don't need more. We don't need more regulations. Maybe they could make background checks better, but that wouldn't have mattered in Parkland, Florida.
Exactly.
Because the guy passed the various checks, and you can't always with these checks. It's not easy to spot. It's not easy to spot a psychopath.
If all the other
they're good. They're good at disguising themselves.
Exactly. And if all the agencies had done the right thing, then he wouldn't have been able to.
And as we're now finding out, the government, there's just fail after fail after failure after failure after failure that he was reported to the local police, the local sheriff's office, dozens of times, and they did nothing. The FBI had a dossier or opened some kind of a dossier on him, and they did nothing. And even the 4 sheriff's deputies, the cowards, what was somebody calling them? The cowards of Broward County, were like outside, quivering in their boots, refusing to go in and do what they're supposed to do. And no one can fault them if they failed to kill the shooter, failed to stop him, but they have to at least try. And if they're, that's their job, is to go in there. And 4 sheriff's deputies just allowed his rampage to continue. And then it wasn't even until another police force, another local police force, what I think it's called Coral Springs, their officers, regular police officers as opposed to sheriff's deputies, went in and I think then it came to an end. And the shooter escaped, but then was captured an hour later or so. So there's just failures on so many levels, and when you do the right thing, and you report somebody who's really has really suspicious behavior that you think is a threat to public safety, and the authorities don't do anything, like what more can you do?
Was this a lot of the chatter? Was this a lot of the chatter at CPAC?
Yeah, people were. Well, sure, and people were talking about how. How important it is to uphold to respect the Second Amendment. That we shouldn't give in to emotional blackmail from a bunch of teenage activists.
Were topics like the budget or healthcare part of the talks or the agenda items, Matthew?
Well, they were talking about money and taxes. I don't think they said much about health care, though. That was that seemed to be on the back burner at this year's CPAC. There was a lot of talk about the PP dossier, the Russian dossier put together by paid the rent-a-spy from Britain, Christopher Steele, who was paid by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee to put together this smorgasbord of slander known as that we're now calling the Russia dossier, and there was a lot of talk about that, and I especially enjoyed the very last event, which was Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, being interviewed on stage by Matt Slapp, the chairman or the head of the American Conservative Union. That was informative and very interesting, and I have an article today at frontpagemag.com explaining what he said. And he said, he seemed to threaten to abolish the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court if the Department of Justice and the FBI are allowed to continue to obfuscate and use it for nakedly partisan political purposes. So, that was very interesting. I thought.
I do too, and I'm happy that there was certainly that discussion, because I think that would have Adam Schiff and some of these other agencies to take the FISA court and that process a little more seriously, and those judges
who were lied to.
Well, not only that, but I didn't necessarily see any of those judges pushing back on and asking some harder questions on any of these things either. Did you? Have you heard of that?
Well, not that we would know necessarily.
Sure.
I don't know. Are there even transcripts kept of their hearings? I assume so, but they're not available to the public.
Do you think that there were some particular things that you would have liked to have included in the agenda at CPAC that just didn't materialize, Matthew?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Were there any particular issues that should have been part of the agenda items at CPAC with regard to speakers, or issues that needed to be addressed that were kind of ignored or not prioritized? Like, I mean, you said healthcare really wasn't one item.
No, but immigration was dealt with.
Yeah, good.
In a few different ways.
Good.
DACA and all that, the so-called dreamer kids,
mm-hmm.
who many of whom aren't so dreamy and aren't kids. There was a lot of interesting discussions. I wasn't. Sometimes I'm not satisfied going to CPAC, and I actually felt satisfied this time. Like I'd gotten my fill of interesting, interesting presentations and so on.
Mm-hmm. So did you come away feeling like, for as a total event, that things that were prioritized did get addressed? I mean, I'm a little worried about things, one like healthcare, because we've just kind of stepped over that one in a big, huge way. We haven't brought up, the government continuing to fund Planned Parenthood. But then again, because of events, things do change. So now we have a priority with, talking about gun laws and immigration. That's still there. And then I'm not sure that enough has been said about regulations. Did I get some of that wrong? Or was there the fact that we are
I think there was some discussion of it, but it's not a very interesting topic. I say this as a guy who works at a think tank in Washington, D.C. If you want to put an audience to sleep, that's a perfect topic.
Yeah, okay.
Ideal topic.
All right, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
There's no question President Trump has done great things in unilaterally slashing regulation.
He's
what part of headed in the right direction?
I agree with you there. Absolutely agree with you. What part of foreign policy was covered?
Well, they were covered. There was some discussion of
North Korea.
Of the terrorists, and it was mostly North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Less focused on Islamic terror and more on North Korea. There was some discussion of Islamic terrorists and of the attack in New York City, where the guy drove his rental truck onto the bike path or in the park and ran down some people on Halloween. So there was some discussion of that. Sheriff Clark was good, as he always is. Former Sheriff David Clark.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there were some. There was a never-Trumper conservative, Mona Charen, who gave a speech and was booed and had to be escorted. I wasn't there for the speech, but I heard about it from people who had sat there, who had gone to the speech, and she was escorted because she said, she called, more indirectly called Trump a rapist. She said that, what about all these credible accusations against Trump?
How'd she get on the calendar?
Sexual harassment and stuff like that. And I'm trying to figure out, well, which of these are actually credible? I don't think there are any that were credible. Even with Roy Moore in Alabama,
right.
They weren't credible. And they're all, 30, 40 years old. So, I think the people of America already passed judgment on Donald Trump, and they put it behind them. So I don't know. Is it wrong for me to say I don't care? Because I don't.
I mean, we went through this in the Bill Clinton impeachment days too.
Right.
Essentially the country said, yeah, we don't like it, we recognize it, but we have business at hand here in these extracurricular activities.
They compartmentalized it, right?
Yes.
Maybe that's what people are doing with Trump. I just think it's too convenient. Since the Clarence Thomas fiasco, when the left got together and just made up all this crap about the man, who's an outstanding jurist. He's probably the most brilliant member of the Supreme Court of the United States right now, and most ideologically solid. He's awesome. But they made up all sorts of stuff about them, about him, stuff that doesn't even make any sense, And we know Anita Hill was lying because she followed him from job to job as his assistant,
right,
or his sidekick or whatever. If things are so bad, why'd she do that?
Exactly.
Is there, you going to argue headed Nussbaum, syndrome, like that New York woman who claimed that she was like beaten into submission by her husband, and that's why she abused their adopted child to death. It's not going to work.
Well, the American people have really spoken, and they've pretty much said we have business that, we need to attend to. We've got to deal with the healthcare thing. We've got to deal with the immigration thing. We got to deal with the taxes. We got to deal with regulations. We got to deal with, law and order and corruption and, whatever extracurricular activities go on between midnight and 6 a.m., so be it. And I clearly understand that there's some priorities here, and having some kind of virtue that you can adhere to inside the Beltway is almost impossible when it comes to the do's and the don'ts. But any closing summaries on CPAC you want to offer?
I thought it was pretty successful, and I was also delighted that my hotel room at the Gaylord Hotel faced the parking lot where the two presidential helicopters were parked while President Trump was speaking. So I got to see them
up
take
close
off,
and personal,
which I'd never seen before. So I just thought that was kind of cool. And I don't know which one he took off in. There's a decoy.
Right.
One is Marine, is designated Marine One when he's in it, and the other is, I don't know.
Well, the decoy.
Zombie Marine.
Zombie. All right. Well, check out, ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Vadum's work over at Front Page Magazine. And if for nothing else, get his book author. He authored Subversion. But Matthew, thanks for being with us and giving.
And I've also got a book that came out a few months ago called Team Jihad,
published
by Center for Security Policy Press. It's about how the leftists and the Islamists and Muslims activists work together to undermine the United States. And so,
excellent. Thank you.
Listeners may want to check out Team Jihad.
Team Jihad. Thank you. And come back again soon.
Yeah, happy to.
All right, thanks. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
You can't handle the truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress. Mike Charlie, 435 921. Grid to mark. Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT, 5
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Got a previous guest with us, Richard Valdemar, who I met, Richard, I guess it was last year sometime in Washington, D.C. at a FAIR, F-A-I-R, convention, which is the Federation, I'm going to get this wrong, for American Immigration Reform, I think it is. Yay, got it right. And Richard's is retired Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. 33 years he spent there. Most of his work was combating gangs, major crimes, and he was also cross-tasked at the time, from time to time, with the FBI. And today he does things like join the Denise Simon Experience to talk about where we are with these things, because that's his expertise. So we want to talk about a little bit about MS-13 and some of the other gangs out there. So Richard, thanks for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I appreciate you having me on, because I've been reading articles recently about MS-13, and obviously the people interviewed in those articles don't really understand how MS-13 operates and how it's spreading across the globe.
Yeah, it is global, and what's particularly fascinating is I think you got a couple of people over there at CNN that are just kind of downplaying this whole thing, saying, it isn't a big deal, and all of America's never even heard of MS-13. When I would argue that's probably not the biggest gang that we have here in the United States, but it's clearly one of the more violent ones, correct?
Yes, it's very violent, but I would say it's one of the biggest gangs because it is transnational. That is, it's found all over the globe. Yeah.
Now, most of these gang members are from El Salvador, but MS-13 was actually born in Los Angeles, right in your old backyard, right?
Right, and I would say it this way: most of the gang members are of El Salvadorian descent. But some of them come from Honduras, Guatemala, other South American and Mexico. But the original ones came from Los Angeles. They were Salvadorians who fled the revolution in the mid-'80s in El Salvador, wound up in the Pico Union District of Los Angeles, where they came in contact with the 18th Street Gang. Some of them joined the 18th Street Gang, but most of them at that time were what we called stoners. They were heavy metal kids and not particularly the kind of gang members you see today. But eventually they became part of the Hispanic gang culture of that era, which they called cholos. And because they had this, some members had joined 18th Street and then others formed their own gang, calling it Mara Salvatrucha. They have a rivalry between those two groups. Wherever you find MS-13, you will find 18th Street also. And 18th Street also was made up primarily of people, undocumented people, illegals who had entered that Pico Union District. So the three major gangs of Los Angeles, 18th Street, Mara Salvatrucha, and the Florence 13 gang, are all primarily made up of illegals.
And I was kind of reading up on this too, and we've got some liberal media outlets out there that are saying most of these members of MS-13 are actually U.S. citizens in some form or another, and not immigrants. But it was born on immigration, and I mean, so you read the article and then Trump's wrong on this, and Trump's wrong on this, and so is Jeff Sessions. But then deeper into some of these articles, then they go on and say that they were immigrants that came here back in, the 80s and whatnot.
Right. If you're talking about 1980s immigration, they came here, many of them illegally, some through sanctuary, and they were in charge in Los Angeles in that Pico Union District of the false identification documents. So the first thing you get when you come here illegally is you get a driver's license, a social security number, and a counterfeit immigration paperwork. So a lot of those people who originally came here had documentation that said they were here legally, but actually were here illegally. Now, since 1980, those people have had children. So those are born here in the United States, but they're still from illegal parents. And so that's what we're seeing. So they play with the statistics to try to make it seem like that they're born and from the culture of the United States, but most of them retain that Salvadorian culture, and especially the Hispanic, which is actually foreign to them, the Hispanic Cholo gang culture, which was part of Los Angeles criminal underworld.
So the issue of sanctuary cities, Richard, is really not a new phenomenon. It's just a new term that has been applied because, I mean, these people, had they knew where to go, and they knew they were going to necessarily be protected in certain areas of LA or Chicago or, New York or wherever, correct?
Yes, and I have to say, I'm a Catholic, right? I'm a strong Catholic. I remember in the 80s that the Catholic Church had places for these people who were coming over under sanctuary programs and being protected by the church when they came over. And so that was back in the 80s. So this problem has existed from back in the 80s and continues to exist. But ignoring the problem did not make it go away. It just got bigger. And then when we began to actually deport these people, they went back to El Salvador and infected El Salvador with this gang problem. And then from El Salvador, they would come back to the United States, sometimes back to the East Coast, which is actually closer to El Salvador than the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And then so they set up parts of the gang in Washington, D.C., and New York, New Jersey, and the East Coast. So that's what happened.
Richard, when we're doing these sting operations on MS-13, we're also likely capturing some of these 18th Street members too, correct?
Yes.
How big, I mean, are they just working in partnership, or are they really merged into one, but we haven't really completely figured that out yet? How does that work?
That's a long history as well, okay? 18th Street gang members were themselves rejects from the Hispanic gang culture when they first arrived. And because a lot of them were illegal aliens, and at that time in the 50s and 60s, most of the gangs in Los Angeles were American-born. And, so they did not accept these people and they were not just immigrating from Mexico, they were immigrating from Guam and, all these other places, South and Central America. And they would come in and they would get indoctrinated in the 18th Street gang group. Eventually, 18th Street became an accepted member of the Hispanic gang culture under the Mexican Mafia. And that's the problem. All these gangs are controlled by prison gangs. So if you're a white person and you join a gang, you get controlled by the Aryan Brotherhood. If you're black, you get controlled by the Black Guerrilla family. And the Hispanics are controlled by two prison gangs, the Mexican Mafia, which is the primary one, and the Nuestra Familia, which is their rival. So when these gang members fall under the protection of these groups, umbrella groups, they begin to war, except when they go to prison. Then they were under control of the prison gang and began to do the prison gangs, which is a more organized crime type activity. After the Rodney King riots of 92, Mara Salvatrucha became Sureños under the Mexican Mafia and gave their allegiance over to the Mexican Mafia. So when you hear people like Beck talk about that we're going to put them in prison and that's better than deporting them, he absolutely does not know anything about how gangs operate. Prison is like their college education. So
it's a recruiting
You send a young man from a third world country and you send him to a California prison, he becomes proficient in the criminal world and falls under the discipline and control of the Mexican Mafia prison gang, which I would say is the most dangerous gang in the United States.
I'm glad you mentioned Mexican Mafia, because nobody, even the Department of Justice or ICE, is not even mentioning Mexican Mafia, which I guess is, from the jihad standpoint, it's kind of like the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the paternal umbrella here that kind of directs and guides all these subordinate gangs, correct?
Well, that brings up a great difference that you can call. The reason that the East Coast is having such a difficulty with these Sureño gangs is that they're not formed in hierarchy and structure like East Coast gangs. East Coast gangs have a corporate structure. You're going to have a president, a vice president. But the West Coast gangs are like terrorist cells. They have charismatic leaders that control small groups or cliques within the gang. Mm-hmm. So trying to take off the president of the gang or the ruling council, that doesn't disrupt the gang. They just take off a cell like we do with terrorists. And that cell expands, the remaining cells expand and take over the function. So you can hit MS-13 again and again and again, and all you do is take off particular cells. Okay, and then it expands and continues to operate. Unlike, say, you wanted to take off the Latin kings, and you took off the leadership, the kings, and their hierarchy. Well, you would damage them much more than you would damage the MS-13.
Well, what's particularly fascinating when we talk about MS-13 or 8th Street Gang or even Mexican Mafia, we have to include the whole financial structure. What is the fundamental financial structure of this? Drug and human trafficking.
And I would add to that counterfeit, documentation. So you would say, when they established themselves in the Pico Union District, 18th Street, Florence, and Mar Salvatrucha, they took over the false identification industry. And they sell that to anybody they want to. In fact, the terrorists in 9/11, many of them had identification that came from Virginia. That identification was provided to them from Salvadorian sources. So these things hurt us in more than one way. But then drug and human trafficking is their other major money income. And, of course, the more money you make, the more powerful your gang is. So, follow the money, right? So So just because you live in, Atlanta, Georgia, and you have a very violent gang and Jamaicans that are operating in your neighborhood, it's not the same thing. They don't have international connections with drug cartels and human trafficking. They don't make $100 billion a year, in that industry across our borders. That's what makes them dangerous. And what do? They corrupt our system. 60% of the money that they make goes to bribery. So they bribe officials not only in El Salvador and Mexico, but in the United States. If you look, we have had an unprecedented number of high-ranking government officials that have been caught, compromised, taking money in bribery. If we can't trust our judicial system, we can't trust our police system, we're in trouble. We're Mexico again. We're the New Mexico.
It's really fascinating that you even bring that up, because when you look at, the waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption, and graft, and theft, and espionage, and, all these other kinds of things. I mean, you take all essentially the kind of scandalous stuff. The last couple of days, I'm thinking to myself, there's nothing that separates us from, El Salvador or Russia. It's just
exactly.
that we try and wave this Constitution, this Bill of Rights around, thinking, see, we're so much better as a representative republic here. And, with the brokenness of the things that we have here, we're not any better off than some of these other countries. So it's
Third world countries, yes. And to back you up on that, I teach a subject, I call it the unholy trinity. The unholy trinity is the union or alliance between American street gangs, Mexican and international drug cartels, and international terrorists. They do have that connection. El Salvador, in fact, was born out of the revolutions funded by, the communists in Central and South America during that 80s period. But they have the unique history of having the PLO support them. Okay, so if you go to El Salvador, you'll see statues of Yasser Arafat. Okay, and in fact, the leader of the Mar Salvatrucha, of all the cliques of Mar Salvatrucha during the time I was in the federal task force, was a guy called Nelson Comandari. And Comandari is not a Hispanic name; it is a Palestinian name, and he was in fact Palestinian. So we've had these ties with terror, drug cartels, and street gangs for a long time. We just don't like to talk about it, especially the federal government.
And now we also know that we have, the whole mix of Hezbollah in the whole component too, correct?
Oh yeah, Hezbollah is operating in Mexico. We know that. We have our State Department telling us that. And it's operating on this side of the border. We prefer not to think that it's operating on this side of the border, but it is.
ICE is running these sting operations, and rightly so. But I would almost claim, I think that they started off with MS-13 because they hit some pretty popular cities like Boston, parts of New York, and whatnot. But it's almost like a deck chair off the Titanic because there are bigger issues out there. And what's particularly fascinating, Richard, is I don't see any sting operations happening in like Chicago. Why would that be?
Yes. Well, first of all, the major part of the work, the grunt work, is done by local police officers and sheriffs. So who really knows about your local gangs, like in Chicago, are the cops that work Chicago, not some college graduate kid that signs up with the FBI and goes to Quantico and gets a small academy and then gets sent to Chicago. He's not the expert on Mars Salvatrucha or the Blackstone Rangers or any of those gangs. He's a fish of water. So what he has to do is he's got to find the local police officers who actually can school him and teach him how to operate. Unfortunately, those local police officers are running on thin budgets with not enough manpower, and they've got 15 cases a day that they're handling. The FBI guys, they get one or two cases, in a year or two, and they think they're overworked. When the cops work in the street, they're having this constant barrage of criminal gang activity. And these neighborhoods, 80% of the crime is committed by gang members. So when we cut back our gang programs, and when the federal government tries to come in and run the operation, we lose money. It's inefficient. We don't know. Now I'm fully for task forces funded by the federal government targeting local gangs, because I was in one. From 1994 to 2004 when I retired, I was part of a federal gang task force in Los Angeles. So they work, but you have to let the local officers utilize those resources to make it more effective, not the federal government.
Well, now that you explain it that way, we clearly know why we're not going to get cooperation out of Chicago Police Department. We're not going to get cooperation out of LAPD either. I mean, right now that, any Fed that steps foot into those cities, they're persona non grata. So they don't want any part of the Fed activity there, correct?
Exactly, and just a recent article, February the 22nd, the Los Angeles Times talks about Trump criticizing law enforcement in Los Angeles on their gang programs, and a lot of what he says is true. But of course, who do the authors of this article go to for their expertise? Mm-hmm. They go to Chief Beck, and it's in his interest to say that crime is down, and actually, he's not even from Los Angeles, and he's more of a politician than a policeman. And then they go to a professor who basically is a wannabe gang member who gets his information from gangs, and then another guy, Alex Sanchez, who's a former MS-13 gang member. So what kind of a portrait are they painting? It's very one-sided.
What is the size of MS-13? Do you have some kind of an estimate here in the United States? Just in the United States?
No, I don't. It's huge. It is huge because they're found in almost every. So I read an article that said 22 states have a presence of MS-13 identified. Well, to identify the presence of those people means that you have a case against them. But they operate for years without somebody putting a case on them. Mm-hmm. And I would bet that the MS-13 can be found in every single state.
Well, I know I saw something that is recent, it's not very recent, it's 10 years ago. In 2008, they said that MS-13 was operating in 42 states and Washington, D.C. So, we're talking 10 years.
That would be more accurate. Yeah, that would be more accurate. And the trouble is, here's what happens. MS-13 comes into a community. They war with the local gangs. The gangs either form alliances with them or they recruit from the pool of young people from that community. So you could have MS-13 members that are not from El Salvador or even have a Salvadorian background.
Yeah.
And they infect that city. And it takes the police, the kid joins at 12. And you ask the gang members, when did they join? They'll tell you at 12. When did they have their first contact with law enforcement? 18, 19 years old. So they operated from the year, when they were 12 to when they're 15, 16 years old before they're identified. That's the problem. They're operating and doing gang and criminal activity before they ever get seen by the law enforcement. Here's what Los Angeles did. Right, if I reduce the number of gang officers I have less contact with gang members in the field, and I don't identify new gang members that appear. So what happens in the computer? We say we have a reduced gang crime.
Yeah.
In that area.
Well, you do because you do because they're not.
If you live in that area, you don't have a reduced gang crime. You just have reported crimes reduced because you're not putting the resources into identifying them.
Oh, that's that wacky accounting, isn't it?
Yeah. See, I belonged to the OSS gang program in the 1980s, and that was the most effective gang program in the nation. And the main thing we did was we don't lie on statistics. We actually go out and mix with the people and find out what's actually going on and report the true statistics. Now, that makes it bad for the community sometimes. Like if you're in a tourist neighborhood, Las Vegas. Well, if you report a lot of gang crimes and gang members, you're hurting your business. Well, so eventually politics gets involved, and when politics gets involved, it corrupts everything.
Well, it's a false sense of security.
Yeah. We have an agenda to sell, sanctuary city, or whatever, gun control, or whatever it is, and we're going to sell it by telling you that this is how effective we are. We're reducing crime, and actually all you're doing is monkeying with the statistics.
And reducing cases because of workload.
Yes. Or reclassifying the case. I remember we used to report statistics in Los Angeles of how many people were killed in gang violence, but they excluded what we called Mexican national murders. In other words, when the cartel killed people, we didn't call that a gang crime. So we could claim half the crime by saying that was not a gang crime. That's a Mexican cartel murder. It's not a gang. Well, it is a gang. And that's another problem. Nationwide, we don't have a universal legal definition for gang.
Richard Valdemar, retired Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department gang expert. Thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. So I'm going to call on you again. Very good information.
Yeah.
All right.
And thank you for getting all that information out there, and because it's not coming across in the media.
It isn't. More coming your way, ladies and gentlemen. Stay with us.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Got a previous guest with us, Stephen Mosher, who is the author of Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the Threat to the New World Order. Fascinating, and it couldn't be any more timely. Stephen is truly a China expert, and very pleased that you could be with us, Stephen. Thanks for your time.
Oh, it's good to be here, Denise.
You know, I have to say, I know that when you write a book, you do it far in advance of when it hits the bookshelves, and then it's got to go to the publisher, and kind of goes back and forth and all this. But Stephen, you actually predicted that President Xi is going to change some constitutions and some laws around in China so that he can essentially rule forever. You predicted that. And that seems to be precisely where he's going. How did you know to predict that, Stephen?
Well, 5 years ago when Xi Jinping took office, he immediately started dominating the headlines in China. Now, you don't do that because you're Donald Trump and you earn the media. You do that because you own the media. And you order the media, the People's Daily and the Global Times, to talk about you all day long. And so if you look back, even at 2013, 2014, he dominates the front pages of the major government-owned press, the Communist Party press in China, in a way that nobody has since Mao Zedong. The intermediate, the transitory leaders, the people like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, the former leaders, never really were that powerful. You can also see it from the fact that he immediately set about to create a personality cult. And he decided to try and convince the Chinese people that he was not just the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party or the generalissimo in charge of the People's Liberation Army or the president of China, as he's sometimes called. He's all of those things, but he's more. He tried to convince them that he was a sort of demigod, that he was all-powerful and he was going to solve all the problems that China would face now and in the future, and he would make China strong and powerful again, defeat the United States internationally, and reclaim China's place in the center of the world. And when you walk into a Chinese house, when you walked into a Chinese house back in the 1970s, you would see on the main wall in the center of the living room a big poster of Chairman Mao. Now, if you were in China, you had to put that poster up, otherwise it was disloyal. You were considered to be a traitor or something akin to it. If you didn't have that poster of the great helmsman in your living room staring down at you like some big brother. Well, now if you walk in the homes of Chinese, you will see in the center of the living room a big poster of you-know-who, Xi Jinping, who's the new Mao Zedong. And one of the signs, of course, more recently, has been that Xi Jinping has moved into Chairman Mao's old home in that place in Beijing called Zhongnanhai, which is the official residences of the Chinese Communist Party leaders, the members of the Politburo, the guys who control the military, the government, and the party. And that house, from the time of Mao Zedong's death in 1976 until now, has been a museum dedicated to, of course, the memory of one of the great mass murderers of human history, Chairman Mao Zedong. And now, of course, Xi Jinping has taken down the museum signs and moved in, taken up residency. If you want, I mean, there can be no more blatant symbol of his utter desire to dominate China than the fact that he's taken up, that he now sleeps in Mao Zedong's bedroom, he eats in Mao Zedong's kitchen, and he holds receptions in Mao Zedong's living room. He might as well shout, I am the new Mao from the rooftops.
So what I'm going to want you to explain this, because what you just described is he's now postured himself to take control of all of the population, certainly with all kinds of layered propaganda, to hate the West, and with the the pictures hanging on the wall. I mean, Stephen, this sounds exactly like Kim Jong-un in the whole Kim dynasty, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, I just wrote an article about the two East Asian dictators. There is little Kim Jong-un and there is big Xi Jinping, and they resemble each other. They are both dictators. In Kim Jong-un's case, in North Korea, of course, he's a hereditary dictator. He's now the third in the line of Kims. But in China, Xi Jinping is the direct descendant, not in a biological sense, but in the sense of control and power, the direct descendant of Chairman Mao Zedong. And I'll tell you what, the Chinese who lived under Chairman Mao, and I know a lot of them, and I've talked to them over the years, I've written books about it, do not have happy memories of that period in time when this great tyrant of China sent 65 million people to their deaths. He tortured them to death, he starved them to death, he worked them to death in concentration camps, he executed them in large numbers during the different political campaigns of that time. And now we're seeing someone who has amassed the same amount of power as Chairman Mao. This has the same desire to utterly dominate China and the world in the way that Mao Zedong had the same desire. And people are going to their deaths in China. We just had yesterday one of the great human rights defenders in China, an attorney, who died mysteriously in a hospital from some undiagnosed illness. And that's what we call in China, the Chinese say that's killing without shedding blood. That's using a poison needle. That's using an injection of poison to kill your political enemies.
That's Putin-esque.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, look, we are standing on the edge of a precipice here because we didn't know, for example, when Lenin took power in Russia in 1919, how bad things would get in the Soviet Union. We didn't really know even when Stalin took power that they would get even worse. But now we know. I mean, we know that we have a new Mao, a new Hitler, a new Lenin, a new Stalin, who has seized absolute power in a country which has a larger military than Russia ever had, which has a larger economy than Germany ever had, and that is utterly determined to extend its reach over large parts of the world. This is a frightening time. We used to spend a lot of time paying attention to the machinations of the Soviet Union. We wouldn't worry about Russia. We were in the middle of a Cold War with Russia. Our troops faced each other across the border between East and West Germany. Now we find ourselves unhappily in the same kind of situation, with our troops in South Korea facing North Korean troops backed by the People's Liberation Army of China, in Korea, with the United States committed to defend Taiwan, which is 90 miles away from the massive People's Liberation Army in China, and away from a China which has declared it wants to take back Taiwan. I mean, we find ourselves in another superpower confrontation. Not that we want to be there, but the fact is, China declared war on us in 1991. They declared, in the person of Deng Xiaoping, who was then China's leader. Deng said, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, he said the old Cold War is over. The new Cold War between China and the United States has now begun. So they've been at war with us in cyberspace. They've been at war with us in terms of their seizure of the South China Sea, of their gutting of our industry, of their manipulation of their currency, and their theft of intellectual property. They've been at war with us for 26 years. And it's about time that we started paying attention, because if your enemy says you're at war, then you're probably at war whether you want to be or not, Denise.
Yeah. If you were Mike Pompeo, the director of the CIA, and you were to include 2 pages in a presidential daily briefing on China, what would you say? What would your 2 pages entail? Because I guess I'm a little worried that maybe this White House isn't getting the message.
Okay, well, 2 things on that front. First is that I have actually spoken to the CIA and about China, about the China threat. And this was several years ago, I was astonished that we didn't have more analysts following China. We need to get a lot more serious about following what China's doing. We used to have 1,000 people watching the Soviet Union, 500 watching their military, about 500 watching political and economic developments. We have a fraction of that number watching China. So we need to get a lot more CIA analysts working on China. We need to make sure that they're fluent in Chinese and that we're getting good information, because China is still in part a black hole where it comes from, where it comes to information about what they're actually doing, what they're actually building in their factories, in their war machine. As far as President Trump, if you read, and I read his books going back to 2000, and even in 2000 he was talking about China as cheating on trade, as China as practicing unfair trade practices. So I think he makes nice noises from time to time about Xi Jinping. But that's what you would expect him to do, because he wants Xi Jinping to lean on North Korea so we can denuclearize the North Korean regime. But I think he gets it. I think he's gotten it for a long time. What I would tell him is that China is moving farther and faster towards dominating its region than anyone thought possible even a few years ago. China's economy is growing rapidly, that because of they've stolen the plans for our nuclear weapons back in the 90s. They've stolen the plans for our F-35, fifth generation fighter a few years ago. They've stolen the plans for various missiles. They have been able to catch up to us very quickly. They didn't have to spend $1 billion in research and development to develop an F-35. They simply stole the plans, and now they're building knockoffs of the F-35 without having, how much did it cost them to engage in cyber theft of all the contractors and subcontractors for that?
Bunch of people at $20 a month.
Yeah, well, the hackers, of course, didn't get paid very much. Even the spies, don't get paid anything close to the money that we pumped into this program. So, yeah, China is competing with us across all domains. Economically, culturally, they're trying to infiltrate our universities by setting up Confucius Institutes.
Yes, I wrote about it.
And which is something that we ought to shut down tomorrow. We simply ought to go to the Chinese.
Rubio has made that declaration too.
He has, and I saw that during a recent Foreign Relations Committee hearing that Senator Rubio asked some very tough questions about the Confucius Institutes and made a very strong statement that the Chinese government should not be allowed to set up propaganda outposts at American universities to subvert free speech and to distort, a proper understanding of China's history and its current politics. It's amazing. We would never be allowed to do the same thing in China. I mean, if we were to propose setting up an American institute at Beijing University, which would tell our version of the history of the world and which would promote the thoughts of Lincoln, Jefferson, and Washington, the Communist Party, functionaries would throw up their hands in horror and say, no, we can't allow that.
You mentioned a minute ago about the number of spies, and we're kind of in a dark hole. It wasn't but a couple of years ago that the CIA was waving the, red flags, going, the people that we have cultivated and recruited are being killed. They're going dark, and so the back channel espionage agents types that were under CIA guidance and management died. They were, kidnapped and taken someplace, or they were assassinated. So,
yeah,
it's not like the CIA doesn't know that. That's why I say, I mean, the matter of presidential daily briefings when it comes to China should have at least 2 pages every day in that briefing. You agree?
It should. China should be right up at the top of the briefing every day. Right up there with the ongoing elimination of remaining ISIS forces and the problems in Syria and some other hot spots. But China is more like this. China is more like a slowly moving glacier that wants to destroy everything in its path. And I think part of that is deliberate strategy on the part of China not to overly alarm the United States. And then sometimes they make very blunt statements, as when a PLA general a few years ago said that war with the United States and between the United States and China is inevitable. But usually they like to move more quietly than that on the international stage. But we need to pay attention to it, because ultimately, terrorism, as I say in my book, The Bully of Asia, terrorism is a disease of the skin. It's very painful. We get wounds, but these wounds aren't deadly. They're painful, they're distracting, and we need to combat them. But China, on the other hand, is a disease of the heart, and a heart attack can kill you. And quite frankly, we have a country with an economy and a military which is rapidly becoming our equal, which wants to eliminate us as the dominant player on the planet. And it's not in our interest to let that happen. I mean, obviously, the world under Chinese control would look a lot more like China than it does the United States. The world under Chinese control would be less free, less democratic, more dictatorial. Little dictators everywhere are encouraged by Xi Jinping's declaration and the fact that he's president for life. And there will be more dictators who seize power as a result of China's dominance if we allow that to happen. And I prefer the world under a beneficent American hegemony than a world under a dictatorial one-party dictatorship headed by someone who self-consciously models himself on Mao Zedong, who again is one of the great mass murderers of human history.
Stephen, during the Obama administration, China had tapped the Obama White House on the shoulder and said, we need some help because we want to get some of the Chinese oligarchs that had been taking their wealth out of China and return to China. And I would argue that we don't know what that real number is on how many wealthy Chinese have left the country, which I would say would be because of their free market work by the oligarchs, and that they can see these warning signs, very much like happened with the Russian oligarchs when the Soviet Union fell. So I would say that that would be a very large indicator that they can see things coming. Do you believe that anybody is cultivating any of those wealthy Chinese wherever they ended up once they fled China to see what they necessarily have to say?
Well, here's the thing, Denise. All of the Chinese dynastic families, we might call them, the 100 leading families in China, the ones that trace their heritage, their ancestry back to the Long March in the 1930s across the length and breadth of China to escape Chiang Kai-shek's armies. All of those elite communist families, the princes and the princesses, as they're called in Chinese, all have family members overseas. Even the top-ranked officials always send a son or a daughter or a grandson or a granddaughter overseas. And they send with them a lot of money. And that money's invested in the American stock market. It's invested in condominiums in New York City overlooking Central Park. It's investigated in very expensive properties down on the coast of Florida, multi-million-dollar properties. Because everybody knows in China that the Chinese political system is unstable. Everybody knows in China that you can be a hero today and you can be a villain tomorrow. And remember that Xi Jinping, the new Red Emperor, has charged 250,000 Communist Party officials with corruption. That's 250,000 people. That means that at all levels of government in China, from all the way down to the county through the provincial level and everything, lots of people have been arrested on charges of corruption. Now, they were probably really corrupt. I mean, I'm not doubting that. But they were also Xi Jinping's political enemies. So he's using this anti-corruption campaign to purge as an excuse to purge his political enemies. So a lot of the money, there's a huge pool of money in China that is trying to escape China. Mm-hmm. There are lots of people in China today who feel that they're on the outs with Xi Jinping who are trying to get out of China as well. That's why the Chinese government has put limits of $50,000 a year on the amount of currency you can legally take out of China, because otherwise, I'm telling you, $1 trillion would leave China overnight if the government didn't clamp down on taking money out of the country. You know, there are some amazing stories of corruption in China, like the former premier Wen Jiabao, who was in office for 10 years, and went in office relatively poor, and left with a fortune of estimated at over $2 billion. Now, how do you save $2 billion on a salary of a few $1,000s a month over 10 years? You don't. What you do is you sell offices. You sell offices. You sell provincial governorships. You sell county chiefs. You sell all the offices you control for a certain amount of money. There's actually a regular pay scale for how much you had to pay in order to get a particular office. And the higher the office you wanted, the more you had to pay. So he collected billions in bribes over the 10 years he was in office. And he's not alone. I mean, this is standard practice in China. This is one of China's great handicaps, of course. This is one of China's great weaknesses, that Chinese officials are on the take, that they're corrupt and they can be bought. So, you know, we shouldn't think that China is any kind of monolithic power with everyone on the same page marching in lockstep towards world domination, because there are a lot of fracture points on the inside of this system.
You mentioned earlier, we got a couple minutes left here, Stephen. You mentioned earlier cyber espionage, and I would argue that we haven't even begun to address what China has stolen from the United States or anything West. I subscribe to a lot of these outside government, U.S. government cyber professional corporations, and the things that they are uncovering and telling us is really terrifying, and yet we can't seem to have a cyber policy such that there's a consequence to China. And in the meantime, we're just giving things up, and there's nothing that's stopping China. Should that be one of the first actions that the United States should take to address the power, or the rising power of China?
Well, I mean, this is part of the ongoing Cold War that China is carrying out against the United States. The FBI, and I've worked with the FBI on Chinese espionage in the United States in years past. The FBI estimates that the total value of things that are being stolen from the United States each year, intellectual property being stolen by cyber thefts, is $600 billion. Now, that's real money. And if you think about that over the course of 10 years, that's $6 trillion. And if you think about it from the time in the late 90s when the Internet became, a matter of common usage, that's probably $12 trillion. There's a huge transfer of wealth from the United States to China just in terms of cyber theft. And the fact is, our systems are porous, so they're not well defended against concerted, government-funded cyber attacks from a Chinese government which has an entire branch of its military devoted to cyber war. So in China, you've got the Army, Navy, and Air Force, but you've also got the People's Liberation Army Cyber War Department, which is the fourth branch of the military. We have four branches too, but we have two land branches, right? The Army and the Marines. Instead of the Marines, they have a cyber war department, and there are phalanxes, there are battalions, there are regiments of Chinese hackers at work on the government payroll in the People's Liberation Army, hacking every day private servers, public servers, government servers, private company servers, and so forth. It's like an ongoing tsunami of cyber attacks originating from China and China's neighbors. Sometimes they put the servers in North Korea and other countries to try to hide the source of the cyber attacks, but China's the worst offender in that regard.
The book, ladies and gentlemen, is Bully of Asia. We've been speaking with Stephen Mosher, and thank you for your time and insight. I'm going to keep calling you back because you're a wealth of knowledge, and thanks so much for sharing it with us.
Well, thanks for helping to inform the American public about the threats that are on the horizon, Denise.
Good deal. Thank you.